The F-35 isn't the weapon. It's the system that decides which weapons win the war. Everyone talks about the F-35 as if the most important thing about it is that enemy radar can't see it. That is true, but it is also almost beside the point. The real story is what happens after it goes undetected. This aircraft can quietly direct a swarm of unmanned drones, guide a missile fired from a ship it never touched, and hand a complete tactical picture to an ally's aircraft without ever transmitting on a channel anyone can intercept. And that same capability has turned this single aircraft into one of the most powerful diplomatic instruments in the entire Western alliance. One so sensitive that America's own closest allies have been blocked from ever receiving it. Stay with me, because understanding how this jet actually works and who is allowed to fly it tells you almost everything about how modern power actually operates. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay up to date with the latest news. There is a specific misunderstanding about the F-35 Lightning II that has shaped almost every piece of popular coverage of this aircraft for the better part of 2 decades, and it is worth naming directly before we go any further, because correcting it is the only way to actually understand why this specific piece of hardware has become one of the most consequential instruments of both military and political power currently in existence. People talk about the F-35 as a fighter jet, a very expensive, very advanced fighter jet, but fundamentally a machine built to outfly and outshoot other aircraft in the sky. That framing is not wrong exactly, but it is dramatically incomplete, and the part it leaves out is the part that actually matters most. The F-35 is not primarily a fighter jet that happens to carry sensors. It is a flying sensor and command node that happens to also carry weapons. And once you understand that distinction clearly, almost every other fact about this aircraft, its cost, its export restrictions, the diplomatic fights over who gets to fly it, starts to make a very different kind of sense. Let's start with the concept that actually explains what this aircraft was designed to do, because you cannot understand the F-35 without understanding the doctrine it was built to serve. Modern military planners refer to this doctrine as network-centric warfare, and the core idea behind it is deceptively simple. Instead of treating every weapons platform, every ship, every aircraft, every ground unit as an isolated actor that fights its own individual battle and reports back afterward, you connect everything into a single, continuously updated tactical network, where information gathered by any single sensor anywhere in that network becomes instantly available to every other node that needs it. Here's what that actually looks like in practice, and this is the part that almost never gets explained clearly in mainstream coverage of this aircraft. Imagine an F-35 flying a routine patrol mission far enough forward that its onboard sensors can detect and track an emerging threat well before any other friendly asset in the area even knows it exists. In a previous generation of air combat doctrine, that F-35 would need to either engage the threat itself or relay a verbal report back through a command structure that then decides how to respond. A process that takes time. And time is the one resource you genuinely cannot buy back in a fast-moving tactical situation. But here's where things become far more complicated, in a good way, for the side operating this aircraft. Instead of that slow verbal handoff, the F-35's onboard systems can package the detected threat data into a specific, structured digital format and transmit it directly and automatically to other assets in the network. A naval destroyer positioned for a missile intercept, another aircraft better positioned to engage, or increasingly, an unmanned drone system that can be tasked with reconnaissance or even engagement without ever putting a human pilot at risk. The F-35 in this scenario never even needs to fire a weapon of its own to be the decisive factor in the engagement. It functions as what defense analysts sometimes describe, somewhat informally, as a quarterback in the sky, the platform that sees the field first and decides where the ball goes next. This is why the comparison to an orchestra conductor is actually more accurate than the traditional fighter jet framing. A conductor does not personally play every instrument in the orchestra. The conductor's value comes entirely from coordinating what everyone else is doing in real time, based on information only the conductor is positioned to fully perceive. That is a remarkably close description of what an F-35 does inside a modern joint task force, and it explains why military planners increasingly value this aircraft not primarily for its own weapons load, but for what it enables everything else around it to do more effectively. Now let's talk about stealth, because this is where the popular understanding of this aircraft gets most significantly incomplete, and where the real technical sophistication of the platform actually lives. Reducing an aircraft's radar cross-section, the technical term for how large and how detectable that aircraft appears on an adversary's radar screen, is genuinely difficult engineering. It requires very specific airframe shaping, radar-absorbent materials, careful management of every surface that could reflect an incoming radar pulse back toward its source, and it requires making genuine trade-offs against other performance characteristics to achieve it. This is real, and it matters, and it is not something to dismiss. But treating radar cross-section reduction as the single defining characteristic of this aircraft's stealth profile significantly understates what modern, low-observable design actually accomplishes. And here is the real question worth asking. What good is being invisible if you cannot also make sense of everything happening around you while remaining invisible? This is where sensor fusion becomes the actual star of the story, and it deserves far more explanation than it typically gets. The F-35 carries an extensive suite of onboard sensors, radar systems, infrared sensors, electronic support measures that detect and characterize enemy radar and communications emissions, and several other systems working simultaneously. In an older generation of aircraft, a pilot would need to manually monitor separate displays for each of these systems, essentially building a mental picture of the tactical situation by cross-referencing multiple data streams in their own head. A cognitively demanding task, especially under the extreme stress of actual combat conditions. The F-35's onboard computing systems do something fundamentally different. They automatically combine, cross-reference, and reconcile the data from all of these separate sensors into a single, unified tactical picture that gets presented to the pilot through the aircraft's helmet-mounted display system. The pilot does not need to consciously integrate radar data with infrared data with electronic emissions data. The aircraft has already done that integration automatically, in real time, and simply presents the pilot with a coherent picture of the battle space. This is what allows a single pilot to maintain genuine situational awareness across an enormously complex tactical environment that would have overwhelmed a human operator working with previous generation, non-integrated sensor displays. And that's not the most important part of this story either, because the electronic warfare capability built into this aircraft extends considerably beyond passive sensing. The F-35's systems are reportedly capable of not just detecting and characterizing an adversary's radar and communication signals, but in certain circumstances actively interfering with, degrading, or manipulating those signals, a capability that moves well beyond traditional stealth into something closer to active electronic combat. The precise operational details of exactly how and under what conditions this capability gets employed remain understandably classified, and any specific claim about exact performance characteristics deserves genuine caution rather than confident assertion. But the publicly acknowledged existence of this general capability category represents a meaningful conceptual shift from earlier generations of stealth aircraft, which were fundamentally designed around the principle of avoiding detection altogether, toward a design philosophy that assumes the aircraft may sometimes be detected and builds in the capability to actively contest and manipulate the information environment even after that detection occurs. All of this connectivity and sensor integration depends on a specific communications architecture called the Multifunction Advanced Data Link. And this is worth understanding because it solves a problem that has historically undermined the value of exactly this kind of networked warfare concept. Any radio transmission an aircraft sends can, in principle, be detected by an adversary, even if the content of that transmission is fully encrypted and cannot be read. Simply knowing that a transmission occurred and roughly where it came from can give an adversary valuable information about your aircraft's location and activity, which partially defeats the purpose of being difficult to detect through radar in the first place. The data link systems used on the F-35 are specifically designed to be highly directional and difficult to intercept, allowing this constant flow of sensor data and tactical information to move between F-35s and other compatible platforms, without significantly compromising the aircraft's low observable characteristics in the process. Now here's where this story shifts from a technical discussion into something considerably more geopolitically significant. Because everything we've just walked through, the networking, the sensor fusion, the electronic warfare capability, is precisely why access to this aircraft has become one of the most consequential diplomatic instruments inside the entire Western alliance structure, rather than simply another arms export decision, among many. Consider what it actually means for a country to be granted or denied access to the F-35 program in light of everything we've just discussed. This is not comparable to selling a country a conventional fighter jet, where the primary consideration is roughly how capable that aircraft is in isolated combat. Granting a country F-35's means granting that country access to an aircraft specifically designed to plug directly into a broader American-led tactical network, one that shares sensitive sensor data, electronic warfare techniques, and networking protocols across the entire alliance. Every country that operates the F-35 becomes, in a very real technical sense, plugged into a shared technological ecosystem controlled primarily by the United States, and that ecosystem depends on trust that goes considerably beyond a simple arms sale transaction. This is exactly the dynamic playing out in the ongoing dispute over Turkey's status in the F-35 program. And it is worth walking through in detail because it illustrates the geopolitical stakes here more clearly than almost any other single case. Turkey was an original partner nation in the F-35 program, contributing to its development and industrial production, and had planned to eventually operate around 100 F-35A aircraft, having already made substantial payments toward jets it had not yet received. In 2019, the United States formally removed Turkey from the program after Ankara proceeded with the purchase of Russia's S-400 air defense system, despite repeated and explicit warnings from Washington and other NATO allies that doing so would be incompatible with continued participation in the F-35 program. The specific technical concern here matters enormously for understanding why this dispute has proven so difficult to resolve even years later. The S-400 is a sophisticated Russian-made radar and air defense system specifically designed, among other things, to detect and track stealth aircraft. American officials have consistently argued that operating S-400 radar systems in close physical proximity to F-35 aircraft would create a genuine risk that sensitive data about the F-35's specific radar signature and stealth characteristics could be collected by the S-400 system and potentially find its way back to Russian intelligence, either deliberately or through simple technical proximity. Given everything we've just discussed about how central low observability and sensor integration are to the F-35's entire value proposition, this is not a minor technical footnote. It goes directly to the core question of whether the aircraft's most sensitive capabilities could be compromised. This is where things become far more complicated than a simple story about one country losing access to one weapon system, because Turkey's efforts to be readmitted to the program have continued essentially without pause for years, through multiple rounds of diplomatic engagement. And, as of recent reporting throughout 2026, those efforts have reportedly gained meaningful momentum, with American officials suggesting a resolution could be reached within a matter of months, contingent specifically on Turkey taking verifiable steps to neutralize or dispose of its S-400 systems in a way that genuinely satisfies American security concerns. But here's the part of this story that most coverage misses entirely, and it's genuinely one of the more fascinating wrinkles in the whole saga. Even if Washington and Ankara reach a full resolution on the S-400 question, that alone might not be sufficient to guarantee Turkey's actual readmission to the program, because a third party with significant influence over this specific decision has publicly voiced serious objections of its own. Israeli officials have stated directly and on the record that they have what they describe as serious reservations about Turkey acquiring the F-35, explicitly citing the fact that a meaningful amount of the technology inside the aircraft was developed by Israeli companies, and stating plainly that this is not technology Israel is willing to share with Turkey, given the current state of the relationship between the two countries. Think about what that actually reveals about how this system genuinely operates beneath the surface of official government-to-government statements. The decision about who gets access to one of the most advanced weapon systems in the world is not simply a bilateral matter between Washington and whichever country is seeking to acquire it. It runs through a complex web of allied relationships, regional rivalries, and specific technology sharing agreements between the countries that actually contributed components and expertise to the aircraft's development in the first place. The F-35 program, in this very real and specific sense, functions as a mechanism that binds a very particular network of allied nations together, and simultaneously as a lever that can be used to enforce specific behavioral expectations on any nation that wants to remain inside that network, whether the specific issue at hand is a Russian air defense system, a regional rivalry with another close American partner, or a broader question of strategic alignment. This exact dynamic helps explain a broader pattern that has become increasingly visible across Europe in recent years. Even as questions about European strategic autonomy and about the wisdom of remaining dependent on American-controlled weapon systems have become considerably more politically charged across the continent, largely amid broader questions about the long-term reliability of American security commitments. Multiple European nations have nonetheless continued moving toward the F-35 specifically, rather than away from it. That apparent contradiction is actually not a contradiction at all once you understand the aircraft's true function. For a European nation, acquiring the F-35 is not merely a hardware acquisition decision made purely on the aircraft's individual combat merits. It is simultaneously a decision about which broader security and intelligence ecosystem that nation wants to remain structurally embedded within. And for most European governments, despite very real and increasingly loud domestic political debates about strategic dependence, the practical calculation has continued to favor remaining inside the American-led network rather than attempting to build a fully independent alternative on a comparable timeline. Now let's address the cost and effectiveness debate directly, because it deserves serious and honest treatment rather than either uncritical defense or dismissive skepticism. And this is genuinely one of the most substantive criticisms leveled against this entire program. The F-35 is, by a significant margin, one of the most expensive weapons programs in human history, when you account not just for the individual unit cost of each aircraft, but for the full lifetime sustainment costs, the specialized maintenance infrastructure required to keep the aircraft's low observable coatings and advanced sensor systems fully operational, and the enormously complex global supply chain required to keep the fleet flying across multiple countries simultaneously. Estimates for the total lifetime cost of the entire program run into the trillions of dollars when calculated across its full projected operational lifespan. And that figure alone has generated legitimate, sustained criticism from budget analysts and military reformers for the better part of 2 decades. And here's the real question that this specific criticism raises, and it's one worth taking completely seriously rather than dismissing. What happens when an aircraft of this cost and sophistication is deployed into an operational environment, increasingly shaped by cheap, expendable drone threats, munitions that can cost a few hundred or a few $1,000s to produce, when the systems required to detect and neutralize those threats can cost dramatically more, sometimes by several orders of magnitude? This is precisely the same cost asymmetry problem that has reshaped conflicts across the Middle East and Eastern Europe in recent years, where the fundamental economics of cheap offense versus expensive defense have placed enormous strain on traditional high-cost weapons platforms of every kind, not just the F-35 specifically. This is where the aircraft's actual function as a networking and sensor node, rather than purely as an individual strike platform, genuinely changes how this specific cost question should be evaluated, though it does not eliminate the underlying concern entirely. If the F-35's core value lies significantly in its ability to detect, characterize, and network threat information to other, less expensive assets in a broader defensive or offensive system, rather than purely in its own individual weapons load and strike capability, then evaluating its cost purely against a single drone's construction cost may be measuring the wrong comparison entirely. A single F-35 acting as a forward sensor node that cues a much cheaper interceptor system, a ground-based directed energy weapon, or an autonomous drone system to actually neutralize an incoming low-cost threat represents a fundamentally different cost equation than expecting the F-35 itself to individually shoot down every single cheap drone in an incoming swarm using its own expensive weapon systems. But that reframing does not fully resolve the underlying strategic question either. An honest analysis requires acknowledging that directly. If an adversary can field genuinely overwhelming numbers of low-cost autonomous threats, there remains a real and unresolved question about whether even a sophisticated networked sensor architecture, no matter how effectively that architecture cues cheaper interceptor systems, can actually process, prioritize, and respond to that volume of simultaneous threats quickly enough to prevent meaningful losses to the network overall. This is precisely the kind of unresolved operational question that current and near-future military planning is actively working through right now, and it remains genuinely one of the most consequential open questions in modern air combat doctrine. This is also exactly why the conversation about directed energy weapons and future integration with unmanned combat aircraft matters so directly for understanding where this entire technology trajectory is actually heading over the coming decade. If future iterations of manned 5th and 6th generation fighters increasingly function primarily as forward sensor and command nodes, directing swarms of lower-cost autonomous drone wingmen, sometimes referred to within defense planning circles as collaborative combat aircraft, while directed energy weapon systems handle the actual physical interception of cheap incoming threats using near-limitless magazines and dramatically lower per-engagement costs, the entire cost equation, currently generating so much legitimate criticism of platforms like the F-35, could shift again, potentially quite significantly, within a relatively short time frame. Several major defense programs are already actively exploring exactly this kind of manned-unmanned teaming concept, treating the expensive, sophisticated, sensor-rich aircraft as the quarterback of an increasingly automated and substantially lower-cost, broader combat network, rather than as the primary and singular weapon expected to individually engage every threat itself. So where does this leave us, and what should you actually be watching for as this specific story continues developing over the coming months? The F-35 is not primarily a fighter jet in the traditional sense that shaped earlier generations of air combat doctrine, and it was never really designed to be evaluated purely on those older, more familiar terms. It is a sensor platform, a data node, and increasingly a coordination hub for an entire networked system of manned and unmanned assets. One whose actual military value depends considerably more on the broader network it plugs into than on its individual performance characteristics in isolation. That fundamental design philosophy is exactly why access to this aircraft has become such a genuinely powerful diplomatic instrument, one capable of shaping and constraining the behavior of even close, long-standing NATO allies, and why the ongoing dispute over Turkey's potential readmission involves considerably more than a simple question of whether one country's air force gets a specific new aircraft. Watch specifically for how the Turkey readmission question actually develops over the coming months, since American officials have suggested a resolution could genuinely arrive within a relatively short time frame, and watch closely for whether Israel's stated objections meaningfully shape or ultimately delay the final outcome of that process, regardless of whatever bilateral agreement Washington and Ankara eventually reach between themselves. Watch for how quickly manned-unmanned teaming concepts, the idea of F-35's and similar aircraft directing genuinely autonomous drone wingmen in actual combat operations, move from ongoing testing programs into confirmed operational deployment, since that specific transition will tell you a great deal about whether the network-centric vision this aircraft was originally built around is actually being fully realized in practice, or whether it remains constrained primarily to the theoretical and developmental stage. And watch for how the broader cost and effectiveness debate evolves as directed energy weapon systems mature and potentially become integrated into this same broader networked architecture, since that specific technological development could fundamentally reshape the entire calculus around what a platform like the F-35 is actually worth relative to the much cheaper threats it may increasingly be tasked with countering. The story of the F-35 was never really just the story of one single aircraft. It is the story of how modern military power has become genuinely inseparable from network architecture, from data-sharing protocols, and from the diplomatic relationships required to actually build and sustain a functioning technological alliance across dozens of allied nations simultaneously. Understanding that clearly tells you considerably more about how 21st century military power actually functions than any specific number describing this aircraft's top speed or maximum turn rate ever could. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us whether you think this aircraft's genuine value lies primarily in its individual combat capability or in the broader network and alliance structure that has been deliberately built around it. And tell us what you think should actually happen with Turkey's ongoing readmission request, given everything we've just walked through about the technical, diplomatic, and regional stakes genuinely involved in that specific decision. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit the bell, because the next generation of air combat systems and the broader alliance dynamics being built around them right now are moving considerably faster than most coverage of this topic is currently able to keep pace with, and we will be here covering every significant development as it happens.